In this video, you're going to learn how to troubleshoot common issues that come up with responsive design in your Bubble application. Things like images not sizing properly, or unwanted scrolling behavior, or elements just not collapsing or expanding as intended on different screen sizes. And make sure to save this video for later, because if you run into other issues in the future, as you continue to refine your designs, you have a checklist that you can come back to. All right, let's jump in. Before you start troubleshooting your responsive designs, I want to make you aware of two different tools that you can use to help yourself test everything. The first is directly within the editor. So on the upper left corner, if you go over to the responsive tab here, Bubble has some built-in tools for you to preview what the responsive behavior is going to look like for all of your elements. You can see here as I drag this ruler up at the top, making the page wider and then more narrow, I can see how some of the things will shift around on my page. So this will give you a good way to very quickly preview what your settings are doing. There's also a few pre-built breaking points that Bubble has added here at the top of the screen so that you can test things on desktop, tablets, and mobile phones. You also have the ability to create your own custom breakpoints if you have a more unique design where you need to make sure that everything is looking good at a very specific page width. So you have the ability to do that there. So the benefit of previewing things in this window is to be able to make changes immediately to the general layouts and spacing, minimums and maximum widths and heights of all of your elements, and see how that behavior is going to play out. Now, of course, because you're still in the editor, you're not going to see any dynamic information populate, which brings me to the next tool to help you with testing responsive design. So when you're in the preview of your page, go ahead and right-click anywhere on this page, click on Inspect, and this is going to open up your browser's console. This is a really helpful tool that's built into most modern browsers so that you can see underlying information about the page. So there's an icon here in the upper left corner of some devices. If you click on that, it will enable the responsive viewer from the browser's perspective. So this isn't a Bubble tool, this is just from Chrome. And again, you'll find this with Safari, Firefox, they all have this type of capability. And you can see I have a very similar design here where I can move between different common devices. I can also select just these general breakpoints up at the top, so that kind of ruler, and then I can also drag on the side here to move the page. Now the benefit of previewing things from your preview here in the browser is that you can actually see things with dynamic information populated, right? Because this is still the preview. So you're going to see me jump between these two tools as we troubleshoot our different issues here. One of the most common issues we see with responsive design is element overflow and overlap. I have two different examples here to demonstrate this. This submit button is far too wide for the group that contains it. You can see that it's moving outside of the boundaries of that group on the left and right sides. And then this text element down below is doing the same but in height. So it's actually exceeding the height of the group that contains it. And because of that, we have some overlapping behavior here between the text and this other group with the gray border that contains all of these elements here. So to correct this, I'm just going to jump into the editor, and I've got the property editor open here. I'm going to select the submit button first, and we're in the layout tab. The settings that you'll want to look at for this behavior are your width and height settings. You have a lot of different combinations that you can work with to correct this behavior so that it's universally adapting across all screen sizes. So the first thing that I'm seeing here is that this button has a minimum width of 500 pixels, okay? So that's telling Bubble that it cannot be smaller than that in width. It has to be at least 500 pixels. And then if I go to the group that contains the button, we can see that the max width is 400 pixels. So there's a problem there. There's a conflict. Our button's minimum width is larger than the group's maximum width. Okay, so there's a couple of things that I can do here. I can remove the maximum width altogether of the group, or I can just make it bigger. So let's say we set this to 800 pixels. All right, so now the button is sitting inside of it because we're past the minimum width of the button, and because the button doesn't have a maximum width, it's just going to keep expanding to match the group. I could set a maximum width on the button, let's say to 600 pixels, so that it stops at that width, right, even if the group is a little bit wider. But there's still a problem here if we look at a mobile perspective. I'm going to go over to the responsive view here, and then go to my 320 breakpoint, which is my mobile view. We can see that the button is very much going to get cut off because, again, the minimum width is much larger than the page overall. So if you imagine if this is an image or a text with an important title, your users are going to miss important information. So what I would want to do here is set the minimum width to something that is at the mobile breakpoint or less. So I'm actually just going to remove it altogether. I'm going to set this to 0. Okay, and so now it'll actually adapt, make itself smaller to fit inside of its parent container. And now if I expand the page here in my preview and I make it smaller, you can see that the button is better adapting to these different breakpoints. And I can play around with the minimums and maximums further so that's a little bit more comfortable. So for example, maybe I don't want the button to be this wide. Maybe I want the maximum width to be somewhere around 300. Okay, or I can set it to fit to content so that it's just as wide as it needs to be to fit the label. Okay, so you have a couple of options there. But as long as it's not going to exceed the width of the group or the page, that's going to be a more comfortable view for your users. Now the text down below is similar. It is being dictated by the height settings that we have here, but you also have some behavior that you can change at the group level. So a lot of times with the responsive behavior, it's not just about one element at a time. It could be surrounding elements that kind of affect each other. So the text right now has no minimum height, no maximum height. It is fitting to content, so we do have several lines here of text, but the group is, let's go to the layout tab here, the group is only as tall as its minimum. It has no other reason to be taller than that. So right now this is set to 100 pixels, which is not tall enough to fit the text. So I could fit height to content, which will expand the height dynamically to fit the text inside of it. Okay, so that's one way to solve our problem. Or if I didn't fit height to content, I could check this box down below. Remember, we're at the group level here, to allow vertical scrolling of the content when it would otherwise overflow. So I'm going to refresh the page so you can see that behavior, right? At the moment here, that height of the group, it doesn't change, but because of that scrolling behavior has been enabled, we get this behavior right here. Bubble will kick in a scroll bar so that we can still see it without having that overlapping design. Or, like I had before, I don't need to have the scrolling, but if I fit to content, then the height of the group overall will expand dynamically, and it'll push everything down below, down further so that it can fit it, right? So we don't have that overlapping. So two different ways to resolve that. It just depends on what you prefer for your design. The next issue we're going to look at are stacking issues. This is a really common design that we see with repeating groups quite often, but this also works if you just have kind of one set of elements just like this, where you've got multiple elements in a row, and on desktop everything is aligned very nicely. But if we go into a mobile view, so let's go to our 320 breakpoint, you can see that this email address is now collapsing onto a second line, and now we have more of a disjointed view. I'm going to go over to the preview here and open up my inspector to look at our responsive viewer. This is again from the browser, and I'm going to select one of my mobile devices, iPhone 12 Pro, and we can see that behavior as well here. Okay, so this is going to help you think about your overall grid designs and understand how universal they are for all different breakpoints. A couple ways that you can address this particular issue here. This group originally is set to a row layout style, and that's why we get that, that horizontal stacking initially like that. I could change this to a column so that they stack vertically instead. This does give us a little bit more room, especially on a mobile device, because now our individual, first, last, and email addresses, they have more space to expand without pushing anything into weird positions. Not to mention, with something like this, first names, last names, email addresses, they can be very different lengths, right? Different number of characters. Some people may have really long names, short names, and so this gives them a little bit more room to be dynamic in that way. But with this change to the group being a column layout, now no matter what breakpoint I'm at, we have a much more universal style. Now the problem potentially with this is that with a more vertical layout, you're forcing your user to scroll a lot more, right? They have to move up and down the page in order to see all the same information. So you could have sort of a happy medium by doing the following. Let's bring this back to a row. And what I'm going to do is group my first, last, and email address elements into a group of their own. So I'm going to group them into a column container here. Okay, so now we kind of have the best of both worlds. Overall, the group is still a row layout. I have the left side of the row, which is this icon, and then the right side is now this new group. And this inner group is set to a column so that those elements stack vertically. So I've really taken advantage of this space so that the user doesn't have to scroll as much up and down on the page to see this information, but we're also not getting that weird displacement where elements are moving to different positions and it doesn't look as clean. Okay, so here are, just kind of moving through our different breakpoints like this. I'm going to go over to my other preview in the browser. We'll switch between a couple different devices. Here's my iPhone, right? Very comfortable there. Let's go to an iPad Pro, right? This is much wider. I can go to a much wider screen there. Obviously, that's not going to interfere in any way. Okay, I'll come back to my normal desktop view. Okay, and you have all the same controls such as your gap spacing. So if you wanted to create a little bit of breathing room between each item, you certainly can. You can also have this icon, aligned vertically or down at the bottom, just depending on where you want to place it. So the idea here is to leverage groups strategically so that you can get the right combination of rows and columns to create a more universal grid system across all of your breakpoints. Okay, real quick here. If you're finding this helpful, we have so much more to teach you in our free extended workshop over at coachingnocodeapps.com/workshop, where we'll guide you through our 4-phased approach for going from idea to app. So if you're looking for a start to finish guide, go ahead and register for it when you're done with this video and you'll get immediate access to the training. I've got the link in the description below and on the screen right now. For now, let's head back to our lesson. The next issue we're going to look at here is text wrapping. And this comes up often when you're looking to display paragraphs of text like descriptions of things, biographies, things like that, where your text may be on multiple lines. And the settings that will have the biggest impact are your minimum widths and your fit width to content. Okay, so in my example here, I have a group which is set up as a row. I have this icon, and then I have 2 separate text elements that don't have any minimum widths or fit width to content settings enabled. And so the behavior by default is that Bubble's going to try to keep everything on one line because it's not being told otherwise, to enforce a minimum or a maximum or anything like that. And so that's basically going to say, okay, we can make these as narrow as possible in order to keep everything on one single line. That's what's happening right now. Okay, now obviously that's not very legible. So one thing I can do here is give the text a minimum width that's going to keep things more comfortable. So I can say, 200 pixels for that text, and the same thing for the second one. We don't want this to get squished too much, 200 pixels. And so now, because we have 200 pixels minimum, 200 pixels minimum, that's 400 total, that's wider than the page width overall, and more specifically wider than this group, that Bubble is now going to collapse things onto multiple rows. So that's where we get that shifting behavior here. Okay, it's only until Bubble can see, even with the minimums, that it can fit everything on one line, will it move everything back there. Okay, now you can mess with the minimums. You can also have fit width to content. So let me remove the minimums for a second. Okay, and I'm going to do fit width to content on this first text. And you're going to see that it's going to force itself onto the second line immediately because this text content is one single paragraph. There is nothing telling Bubble to break things into sections, so that the widths stay more narrow. If I were to break up this text into multiple lines that were shorter in width, we're going to see what happens here. Notice that the width right now is 689 pixels. Okay, I'm hovering over this and I can see that that dimension, 689. Okay, and I'm going to break up this first paragraph into smaller bits. Okay, so let's do this. I'm going to make this smaller here, just kind of randomly choosing where I'm going to break it up like that. All right, and hopefully you can see now. Okay, and now you can see that the width is 238 pixels because Bubble is going to honor, my paragraph breaks that I have here. Nothing is actually a longer line, therefore the text element overall doesn't need to be as long. So again, it's fitting to content in that case. So just be aware that there are multiple factors here. Our next issue is another very common one that we see all the time with responsive design, which is extra white space. So here we have a group with 2 inputs. We have a checkbox and a lot of extra space down below. Now I also have a hidden element so that when I check the box, I see this button. Again, I have more space than I really want in between the checkbox and this button. So there's actually 2 things that I want to call out here to address the extra white space. Let's jump into the editor. The first thing is this checkbox's height is far too tall. It doesn't need to be this tall here, and that is simply because the minimum height of the checkbox is set to 100. I'm going to remove that minimum height, okay, and I'm going to have it fit height to content. So it's only as tall as it needs to be to display the label comfortably. We don't want to have any overlapping or anything like that. Okay, that's the first thing. So I'm going to refresh the page just so that we can see some of that extra space go away. All right, so it's been reduced just a little bit, but we still have this extra here, which is really the space that the button takes up. But when the button is hidden, I don't really want to see that there. I only want the space to show up when the button shows up. So the reason that that's happening is because my submit button by default is not visible on page load. Okay, it's hidden. And it's not collapsing when hidden. if I check this box, then you can actually see here, even in our preview, that the group's height has now collapsed because the space that the button takes up has gone away. It has collapsed to 0 pixels in height only when hidden. Okay, so when I preview the page, the height of this group overall is going to be dynamic. Okay, check the box, button is displayed, the height of the group expands as well. Uncheck the box and it reverses. Okay, that is often the behavior that most designs will want to have so that you don't have extra white space, for no reason there. It can actually make things look like they're broken. Bubble's default behavior when you add a new element to your canvas is to automatically have the collapsing setting enabled. Okay, so that's already turned on for you, again, because it's a common behavior that you want for most of your elements. But just be aware of that. If for whatever reason you did want to hold that space, then you can deselect that setting. And of course, the height of the group itself also matters. Notice that the minimum height of the group is 100 pixels. It's also fitting to content. If I set the minimum height of the group, let's exaggerate it here, to 800 pixels, right? That's the first thing that you're going to see. So pay very close attention to all relevant elements, dimensions, because they can have a ripple effect on the things inside of it. Our next issue here is actually the reverse of what we saw before, which is not having enough space between elements. Now, on this breakpoint, my default breakpoint here, this is fairly normal, right? I've got a group here and I've got 2 buttons side by side. They're on one single line in our row. That's all good. We don't have any weird issues there. But as I make the page more narrow, we're going to do this slowly here, right? There's a point where, now there's no breathing room in between them, okay? It would be better if we had a little bit of space there, so that your target areas when you're clicking on your buttons, you don't accidentally click a button that you don't intend to. Not only that, as we get even more narrow, okay, we're going to get to this point right here, so more of our mobile breakpoint. Now the button submit has collapsed below the discard button, and that's simply because we have some minimums there. So, with both of the buttons at 150 pixels minimum width each, we don't have enough space at this breakpoint to have them side by side. So Bubble's going to move the submit button down below. But again, we don't have a lot of breathing room. They're touching each other on their bottom and top borders. So what we want to introduce here is gap spacing. So if you go to the container that holds those elements, you can apply gap spacing between your elements by checking this box, and then you have both the row gap and column gap. So at the moment here, what I want to be looking at is the row gap. So let's say I add 20 pixels of space there. Okay, so I gave it a little bit more breathing room, and as I make the page break the page width a little wider, here I can see how my column gap affects things. So 20 pixels there, right? So it forces a consistent amount of space in between your elements, regardless of what your minimums, maximums are. It does mean that, it'll make the buttons more narrow sooner in order to maintain that gap space, but overall, that's going to be a better design, right? Now, as we get wider, the row and column gaps don't matter as much because we're not going to see those. But it really is just when things come together that we want to maintain that little bit of space there. It also makes it easier for the user to click the button that they want and not run into an accidental click. Next up are table cells. It's really easy for tables to have issues with their widths and heights because basically every cell is its own group. Every column is its own group. Every row is its own group, and the table overall. So you have these different dimension settings and fit to content settings at all of these different levels, and so you can, mix and match them to get the precise table design that you want. So I'm going to show you a couple things to start with that'll give you a good baseline to build off of. So the default behavior, if you don't put in any specific widths or heights or anything like that, is that Bubble's just going to evenly distribute the widths and heights of all of your elements to fit the table's dimensions overall. So right now I have a table that has no maximum width, so it's maxing out at its parent, so it's this gray border group here, right, that holds both this title and the table. And same thing for the height. Okay, so if we go to the table level, I see there's no max width, there's no max height, but it is fitting to content. So it's only going to be as tall as the number of rows that I have here. Okay, now because there's no specific width at the table level and I have no specific settings at the column level, Bubble's going to evenly distribute the widths of each column, right? They're the exact same in width. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take each of these columns, I'm just holding down my shift key to select all of them, and I'm going to fit them all to content so you can see what happens just with that one setting change right there. Okay, our content inside is actually more narrow, and so therefore the columns can be more narrow too. Now we have a lot of extra space here because with the more narrow columns, there's, we don't have anything else to fill the rest of the table, which is supposed to be expanding to its parent group. And so to correct that, we're going to go to the table level and also fit the table to content, okay, which is in turn going to fit to all of the columns, which is fitting to all of the text elements inside. Okay, so now I have a much more compressed table that fits perfectly around the content that I have inside, no more, no less. Now another thing I can do is the following. I'm going to uncheck the fit width to content on all of these, and I'm going to give each of these columns a minimum width of, let's say, 300 pixels. Okay, now this is 4 columns at 300 pixels each. That's 1200 pixels total. Notice on my 992 page breakpoint here, obviously the table is a lot wider than that page. So what's going to happen there? What kind of overflow behavior are we going to get? You see this right here, right? It is overlapping the outer group. This is obviously not behavior that we want, and the reason that that's happening is because this table is also fitting to content. We're basically telling Bubble, no matter what, make it as wide as it needs to be in order to fit that content, which is restricting us a little bit. I'm going to uncheck this box. Okay, I'm not going to have the table fit to content, but I still am going to force the columns to be 300 pixels wide at least, right? That's the minimum. So what do we have with that slight change there? Well, now the table is going to adapt a little bit more, and it's going to kick in this scroll bar so that we can move through it horizontally, but stay within the boundaries of the table overall, right? It's not going to move past the outer elements. So you see how just those individual changes can affect, how the table is going to display. You can of course mix and match all of these. If you wanted, for example, the email first and last to fit to content without any minimum, but we allow the unique ID to be more dynamic and it can go wider, you can of course do that. It's really just going to depend on what exact content you have inside of your table. Now we're going to take a look at images. This is definitely an element you'll want to pay attention to when it comes to responsive design because images can easily get distorted at different page breakpoints. So here's what I recommend for most design use cases. With your images, go into the layout tab here of your property editor. Make sure that the fixed width setting is turned off and that you set a minimum and a maximum. So what is the smallest you'll allow that image to be and what is the largest that you'll allow it to be. So this will first allow the image to resize itself as the page width changes. You can see here, I'm going to scroll down a little bit, you can see the image is becoming smaller, and then as I make the page bigger, it will grow only up to 400 pixels here in width. Okay, so you can determine what you want those settings to be. Now I also recommend that you keep the aspect ratio fixed. This way the proportions are always going to be the same no matter what your page size is. The best thing that you can do is find the original dimensions of your image. So you can do this, some browsers will have that information for you, or if you just look at the property details of the image, if you're uploading it from your computer, for example, find the original dimensions. So in my case, I can open up this image here in a separate tab, and my browser will actually tell me that this image here is 512 by 510. Okay, so this is almost a 1-to-1. It's nearly a perfect square. Okay, I'm going to call it a perfect square for now. Let's say 510 by 510 or 512 by 512. And you'll want to put that either the original dimensions into the aspect ratio settings here, or if you know what the ratio is, right, if it's obvious that it's a 1-to-1 or a 16 by 9, something like that, right, common ratios, put those in these settings here, because this setting will ensure that the dimensions will always stay proportional no matter what size the page is. Okay, so this is not about the true width and height of the image, right? This is a ratio. Okay, so if I know that my image is, it's 2 pixels off, but let's say that it's 510 by 510, I know that's a perfect square 1-to-1 ratio. I could also put 510 by 510 here. It is the exact same ratio. So if you have an image with kind of funky dimensions, the easiest thing to do if you don't know how to calculate the ratio is just to put in those original dimensions here, because the ratio will be calculated for you. And if you keep it fixed, it'll maintain that ratio as you resize here. So from there, it's just a matter of, what's the largest you want to allow that image to be, or what's the minimum width that it should be no matter what size the page is. Okay, that's going to give you the most reliable output of your images for most use cases. Now let's look at unnecessary scroll bars depending on the page width.
here in my example, I'm on my desktop view of this design, and I have a repeating group here that I'm able to scroll through. So I'm really only looking at a little over 3 rows at a time as I scroll through this list. Now, if I move into one of my mobile previews, so I'm going to click on Inspect again here, and I'm in that responsive viewer here within my browser. Notice that in the mobile view, that scroll bar has gone away, and I'm actually seeing all of the items in my list at once without having to look at an extra scroll bar. This is an intentional design so that, on mobile, since I know that the user is already scrolling more than they would on desktop, I don't want to introduce another scroll bar that could trip them up and kind of create some confusion around the double scrolling, especially when the entire width of this element is nearly the exact same width of the page, and it could be a little difficult for them to scroll at the page level compared to scrolling within this list here itself. So the way that I've accomplished this, where on mobile we don't have a scroll bar, but on desktop we do, is through a condition, okay? By default, this repeating group doesn't have a max height. Okay, it can be as tall as it needs to in order to fit the content within the data source. And we're also setting the height to fit to content, right? So it's just going to be as tall as it needs to be to see everything in the list. But I have a condition here that says when we are greater than or equal to 800 pixels in width, then we are going to give that repeating group a max height of 200 pixels, which is quite short, right? Again, this is on the desktop here. This is limited to 200 pixels in height. Obviously, we have more content to show than that, and so that's where Bubble is going to automatically kick in a scroll bar so that I can still see all of the content. But if I'm below 800 pixels, then that repeating group will expand all the way. So I'm going to show you here as I drag in real time, we'll see that appear and disappear right there. You see that difference, right? So the width here, as it changes, when we go above 800, the repeating group will fix itself to 200 pixels. We see the scroll bar right there. And then as I move under, then the repeating group expands all the way. Now, obviously, this is going to be dependent on your specific content needs and design needs. The last thing you want to do is automatically display, hundreds of items in a repeating group list on any breakpoint, because then that will contribute to some performance issues. Okay, so be more strategic about this, but I wanted to call out that you can use conditions to change the scrolling behavior so that it best suits the device that the user is looking at this on. And finally, we also have a similar concept here with changing the appearance of this text according to different breakpoints. So very similar to what I did with the scroll bars there. So this is my largest display of this text. When I'm on a desktop view, I'm going to slowly drag the page width down. So that's one change that we have here to the text. I've changed the color. I've also changed the sizing. It's a little smaller. And I have one more change as I move even more narrow here on the page width. The text reduces in its font sizes, and I've changed the color again just to really highlight these differences. So this is the same text element. It's not 3 different text elements, but we're using 2 conditions to change away from the default setting here. So this is my text right here. By default, it's going to be 50 pixels in size, and we have this darker blue color. And then I have 2 conditions to say if we are between 400 and 800 pixels, then we'll change it to green, 35 pixels in size. And if we're below 400 pixels in page width, then we'll change it to blue, and the font size will reduce even further to 25 pixels. And one thing you'll want to keep in mind is for your application, what are those key breakpoints? The more consistent you are with all of your elements, using the same breakpoints for changes, the cleaner it's going to be for your users. You may find that certain elements are just more unique in how they need to change in their widths, their heights, their font sizes, their colors, things like that. So pay attention to everything, but make sure that things don't get too disjointed with too many conditions making a whole bunch of changes all over the page. You can also help yourself by creating your own custom breakpoints here so that you know where those benchmarks are for your application. But the concept of breakpoints in responsive design and really customizing responsive behavior is something that you want to take advantage of, right? Not every design is automatically going to be universal across all page sizes. So using breakpoints is going to help you fine-tune things for your app.
All right, I hope that was helpful. We've got more great lessons coming up for you on the next screen. And don't forget to register for that free extended workshop. The link for that is in the description below.